Hello and welcome on France 24 and Radio France International. We are in Abidjan, where our guest is Stéphane Séjourné, French Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has just completed his first African tour. Hello, Mr. Minister.
Hello.
I am here with Marie Normand, my colleague of RFA.
Hello to both of you.
Stéphane Séjourné, your tour took you to Nairobi, Kigali and Abidjan. In Rwanda, you participated in the commemoration of the 30 years of the Tutsi genocide. This led to some confusion on the French side. On Thursday, the Élysée released to the press these words: France could have stopped the genocide with its Western and African allies, but did not have the will. These are very strong words, which we do not find in the words of the French president's words afterwards. Why?
France sought reconciliation, and the French president's speech back in 2021 reflects that. In fact, it is thanks to his speech in 2021 that I now, as Minister of Foreign Affairs, can attend events like the commemoration. In fact, it was an event full of great emotion. We heard a number of very moving testimonials, quite atrocious stories that spoke of the genocide, in fact, the last genocide of the 20th century. There was a lot of talk about what was said, but it really shouldn't take away from all of the introspective work that we have been doing, seeking responsibility, assuming responsibility for what was done. And this was all started back in 2021 by the French president. So I think such discourse is vain, and I actually spoke with the French president about the commemoration, and it's thanks to that we can continue forward with reconciliation.
In 2021, President Macron mentioned the damning responsibility of France. Why didn't you take this engagement with the past to the end? And why not apologize?
Well, as was said during the commemoration ceremony, the international community was far from the task. It was not living it up to its responsibilities. Back in 1994, the French president said that France had its own level of responsibility to account for. And ever since then, with Rwanda, there have been a number of speeches covering the fact that there needs to be further cooperation, greater work from Francophone nations, and also a number of agreements have actually been signed off since then. And this is in line with what we have been wanting to do with the Rwandan powers-to-be. So we wanted to go through that level of introspection, and we wanted to push forward. This is something that has been expected of us, and thanks to that, we can now push forward with cooperation with Rwanda and the French-speaking nations.
The conflict in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo at the borders of Rwanda, Paris condemns both countries for supporting the armed groups. Is this balancing act sustainable?
Well, we believe that we need to keep the peace. And as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I need to send a clear message to both parties. A clear, firm message. One so that we can pick up again with the peace negotiations and peace discussions in a way so that we will avoid escalation, because that is a real risk in the local area. So this is something that I have said to both counterparts, and I'm in contact with them both very frequently on these topics. We, be it both Rwanda or the Congo, we are in constant contact with them. We are constantly discussing these issues.
Could France take sanctions against Rwanda? Emmanuel Macron said so a year ago. 1 year went by. Is this still relevant?
We are still trying to get through the clear messages, and our main objective is to pick up with the peace negotiations, and that is the content of the discussions that I've had with my counterparts. And I'm certainly hoping for, in the coming weeks or months, to have a breakthrough.
In Paris?
I can't confirm that for the time being.
Another region, more things at stake. In Senegal, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, the newly elected president of Senegal, promised a systemic change. The new head of state wants to do away with a CFA Franc. What does France think of the relationship with the president, with these new hopes?
First and foremost, to be perfectly open and honest with you, I would like to say the democratic process has worked. There's been a political shift, as has been the case in many countries. Now, there are different policies at play, but I think all of us can be quite happy to see that the Senegalese institutions were strong, that people were able to vote, and elections were held in a completely transparent manner. So it is now up to Senegal to rejoice in the fact that they were able to build a country where they can have political changeover. This is what we call a democracy that is alive. And I think it sends a positive message to other regimes who believe that power only comes through by force.
How do you foresee the relationship with this country?
Well, obviously we want to work with the country. I have sent out an invitation for them to come to Paris if need be for bilateral discussions. We will definitely be in touch with them. But that said, I think this is a fine example of democratic change. And when you have such change, it is an opportunity for new ideas to come in, with new governments to come in. And this was done in a constitutional way. France was very clear on this point in the past. And we said it to the former president that within the framework of the constitution, elections need to be held. They were, and I think it is a good thing.
Bassirou Diomaye Faye wants to leave the CFA zone. A reform was announced in 2020. Did it fail?
As for the CFA, well, we're no longer part of the governing bodies. And in France, we no longer have reserves to uphold the currency. In fact, I don't really have a position on the topic. If African nations can agree to change the name or to change the way the currency is organized, well, that is their sovereign right. Obviously, we would like to help them through that process if that's the case. Now, if they just want to change the name, if they're changing the way the currency is organized, well, again, that is up to the African states. It's not up to France to have a position on the matter. Now, we have pulled out of the governing bodies of the CFA Franc. Now it's up to African nations to decide on its future.
Emmanuel Macron announced at the beginning of 2023 a reduction of the military troops in Africa, and his special envoy in Africa, Jean-Marie Bockel, declared recently that France would stay in Chad. And Chad has one of the biggest French bases in the continent, and Chad is closer, has got closer to Moscow. Isn't that a problem?
Well, as was said in terms of those military bases, and Jean-Marie Bockel said that as part of the consultation process, it is up to the armed forces and Jean-Marie Bockel to publish the report on the consultation process. But the aim is for the French bases to have fewer troops, fewer staff, for there to be greater local involvement with national-level forces and African forces. Now, we are currently listening to the consultation process, and I think that is what history has shown us, in fact.
What about if they've signed a partnership with Russia, will you still stay in the country?
Every nation is free to choose whatever partnerships they want to have. All I would say is that when working with Russia, it's up to governments signing agreements with Russia. I just want to tell them that it is never free and it's always changing. Never free, always changing. The Russians always seek compensation one way or another. either through primary resources, national resources, or they ask to be paid to provide some form of security. So it is up to each country's own responsibility to choose what they want. And I don't think it is true to France's form to comment on various nations and what sort of bilateral agreements they may have or not have with Russia.
With the French Foreign Affairs Minister, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger are countries that France left. Do you still have open channels of discussion with them?
First, we pulled out of those countries because we were asked to pull out of them. Now, France will always do more with its partners who want it to do more and will do less with others.
And with those three countries?
Now, it makes perfect sense for us to pull out. Now, that said, we didn't pull out in terms of humanitarian aid. We maintain close contact with civil society. It's important to remember that. So we're continuing to work in the countries, but not with governments or local authorities. We continue to work with humanitarian organizations and civil society.
What about Morocco? France is getting closer. Could they serve as an intermediary with the Sahel countries?
Morocco is becoming a shore regional power, and it must be so that the region can have organization and stability. So Morocco taking initiatives in the region are all very welcome. Again, it is up to the people in Morocco to determine what agreements they will and will not sign. But I think certainly they have a desire to work closer with their neighbors.
What is the cost of this rapprochement? Is France changing its stance as regards Western Sahara?
Well, I've said in the past when we were there that we recognize the fact that Morocco is going to develop the area from an economic point of view. In fact, when we were there, we were accompanied by a number of public operators to help the Moroccans develop that area. Now, that said, as for the diplomatic relations, that's up to the heads of state. I have no further statements to make today.
Economic recognition, mainly. So we leave the African continent after 6 months of war, of retaliation of Israel against a terrorist attack of Hamas and 33,000 dead or more. Washington mentioned for the first time that its support could be conditional. Is this an idea that is also making its way into the European Union and Israel as the prime partner?
France is acting within all diplomatic circles. In fact, in a few weeks' time, we will be discussing with Arab nations, America, England, Germany. We'll be talking with them about a political process to find security in the region. In addition, we're continuing the consultation process for a possible resolution before the UN Security Council. So it will be put forward by France. It would be an opportunity to outline the fact that the 7th of October was in fact a terror attack. It will also provide a first ever definition of terrorism within the United Nations, because it still hasn't been defined yet. And will also outline a number of political points behind a two-state solution. So this is a discussion that we are driving and we're pushing forward. Within that consultation process, yes, we will need to look at other key power play elements, so that we can try and open up humanitarian inroads. We are calling for, and we're still calling for, openings in the north and south, in Rafah and Gaza, so that at least 300 trucks can pass through.
And do you want to make your support conditional?
No, we just want to use our influence. We have multiple ways of utilizing our influence. So obviously, we can provide more sanctions. France was the first European Union country to call for sanctions against violent colonizers in the West Bank. So we will continue to do so if we can bring about those openings for humanitarian inroads. And also against Hamas, we would just like to say that 3 French citizens are still taken hostage in Gaza, and their freedom is unconditional.
A solution with 2 states is something that Paris is in favor of in order to find an outcome to the conflict. Will France recognize, just like Spain has, Palestine as a state?
Well, the French president has said it quite clearly. I'm not going to go against what the president has said. I believe that this is deeply tied to the peace process. To politically recognize the Palestinian state without providing a political solution for the area would be a grave mistake. So we can always be quite happy here at the European Union to say, yes, unilaterally, we recognize the Palestinian state. But I don't think it would be useful to do it without a peace process and without incorporating that as a primary condition of the peace process, so that we can bring an end to hostilities, ensure security for Israelis and Palestinians. We need to remove politics from the situation. It's not a political matter. We're talking about a solution. I think we need to see it as such.
Stéphane Séjourné, this 2-state solution, the Netanyahu government doesn't want it, and there are demonstrations that have started up again against the government. Do you think Benjamin Netanyahu is an obstacle to the solution of the conflict?
So Israel is a large democratic nation, and there are likely to be elections held. As the French president said, we will work with the political leaders that the people choose. Now, we may not agree with them, but it is not up to us to judge whether they are legitimate or not to exercise power. Israel is a major democratic nation. We will remain on friendly terms with them. We may not agree with their policy, with the government, as the current case, with the humanitarian issue.
Another war at the gate of Europe, the war between Ukraine and Russia. Last week, the French Minister of Defense and his Russian counterpart talked, but the 2 versions were very different. Isn't there some contradiction between that and President Macron's proposal that he mentioned recently to send troops to Ukraine?
Now, just to remember the context of the conversation. The conversation wasn't about the conflict in Ukraine. It was a conversation about the terror attacks in Moscow. We have a long-standing legacy when it comes to working with Russia. We cooperate with Russia when fighting against terrorism. And that is why the Minister for the Armed Forces reached out to his counterpart to talk about cooperation, share information, again, when it pertains to the terror attacks. That said, the 2 press releases were very different. We actually spoke to our ministers of the armed forces and defense, and I think I know which press release I want to believe.
Cooperation continues in spite of the war.
Well, it isn't continuing. It was just a proposal that we made.
You did pass on information.
Now, the Russian press release was one that didn't speak of cooperation. The press release was very different to our press release.
But can one still talk to Moscow, even in the middle of this informational war?
Well, I don't think that it is currently in our interest to discuss anything with Russian leaders because the press releases and the reports that they provide are lies. So I think maybe we need to build back trust first. I think we need to see a change in Ukraine in terms of what is happening from a military point of view, but certainly for the time being that isn't the case.
What about Ukraine losing ground? The American aid is blocked. If Donald Trump was elected, would the Europeans be able to hold everything alone?
Europe will provide aid in the long term, and everyone needs to believe in that. It's a matter of European existence. because obviously it is a long-term security risk. There is a lot of uncertainty as to support for Ukraine, but also there is a lot of uncertainty as to whether NATO should provide assistance or not. Trump has made a number of rather concerning statements, which raises concerns about whether the United States will help Europe if Europe comes under attack. So there are a lot of questions in the air. So we need to organize ourselves politically. What that means, that we need to organize ourselves as Europeans with European defense, not to replace NATO, not to replace cooperation that we have with allies, but as an addition. And it is also up to us to continue to provide aid to Ukraine. And Russia needs to believe that Europe will continue to provide support. It's fundamental as part of our strategy, of our deeply held beliefs, and it's fundamental for peace in the region. Obviously, we all want to see peace return to the region.
Ukraine might still win the war even without the Americans? Is that what you're saying?
I think Ukraine can win the war, but all depends on our help.
As our help?
Yes, all our help. So here we're in Côte d'Ivoire. The president reiterated their support, and I think that we can see the proof of that in the UN vote when Côte d'Ivoire voted on it. And I think it is a message that was clearly understood by Africa.
The trip of the president to Ukraine, is that still on?
Well, I can't speak to that, obviously, for security reasons. There will be a number of initiatives taken by either myself or the French president to show further support in a material manner or to either travel to site to make certain statements.
It's a war that is weighing on the European election campaign because the Union is going to renew its parliament, and there's a breakthrough of extremes according to surveys. The Renew group, which you're leading, stands as a wall against these nationalist and populist parties, but they are still gaining ground.
European institutions may be blocked after the vote.
That's what you think?
It is something that I fear, and it may very well come to realization if there is a blocking minority that comes in. When we look at our own experience, the President for the European Commission was elected with just 8 votes 5 years ago. And yet we now have a large majority. Or certainly we thought we were going to have a much larger majority at those elections. So yes, EU institutions may be blocked, be it in terms of policy that the Commission is going to put forward, or even be it in terms of the people we're going to be putting into positions of power. But when we look at what's happening with Ukraine, it is a time in history where there is a great level of risk. The US elections, with a general fear that the American allies may not act, given that they're so close to their own elections. EU institutions may be blocked. And as you yourself mentioned, a Russian attack that may continue to push forward. That is the worst-case scenario. So yes, it is a very important election in Europe. In fact, it's probably the biggest ever since 1979. This is something that I've said multiple times in interviews. I truly believe that the rising extremes, the rises of the far right, is something we're seeing in all countries. Take Portugal, for example. It was the exception, especially when looking at the rise of the far right. Now they're at 18, 19, 20% for the far right party. So yes, it is very concerning. What that means is that pro-Europeans, they need to mobilize, they need to step up to the plate, and they really need to act. It's up to us to convince all Europeans that Europe is there to protect. We need Europe, given the current climate, because Europe is there to protect. And for the past 10 years, Europe has guaranteed peace.
A last question on Haiti. During the first stage of your African tour, you met with authorities in Kenya, and you had converging views, particularly on Haiti. France is in favor of the support given by Kenyans to the police in Haiti, but the money is not there. What happened?
We are working with all parties to raise money. France will help because, in fact, we have already helped, and locally our embassy is doing some fantastic work, which I would actually like to congratulate them for.
Thank you, Minister, for having answered our questions, and thank you for being with us on RFI and France 24.